Hello and welcome to this game review. So in this one, you mentioned there were a couple of obvious blunders which somehow don't require attention, but there's a bit too many of these obvious tactical blunders to not talk about them, right? This is clearly a pattern, at least in this game, and this should be considered quite seriously, as tactics are what decide games. So let's take a look. So it started as this Scotch gambit, which is not really a gambit. After knight d4, bishop d7, already white has used a lot of time here, which I'm a bit confused about. As if you're playing this opening, then what black played here is kind of the main line here, right? Knight f6 is the main move. After e5, d5 is the only move for black. And you played bishop b5 and all of this quite slowly, so I'm not really sure what your opening repertoire is and why you're playing these moves so slowly. If you don't know these opening moves, I'm not sure how your openings are in general. Okay, knight e4, knight e4, and here the main idea for white is to take with the bishop on c6. Black will recapture with the pawn, because if he takes like this, then black is losing the pawn structure, and he doesn't have the bishop pair either, so this position doesn't really make sense for black. So what they do is take it like this, and now white will try to use his pawn majority on the king side, 4 against 3, which is the main idea of white's position after all, while also sometimes trying to use the weak c5 square. But okay, this is kind of similar, and now the battle lines are drawn. The white has a 4 and 3 majority on the king side, while black has the open b file, he has central pawns, and he has a good potential bishop on c6. So okay, bishop f5 castles bishop c5, and here king h1 was played quite quickly, and well, this is very strange because we should always look at checks, captures, and attacks, and it is likely that you actually saw this move. But of course it's not that simple, because after rook takes f2, black cannot recapture the rook because the bishop is hanging and white has one material. But the point is, as in the game, what happened after bishop takes d3, now the rook is attacked, so white can't take the bishop, and the black has won a pawn. He will next move away the bishop, and he will be left with a pawn up, as well as the bishop pair and better development. So in general, king h1 is a very strange move, as in the opening we have a couple of goals that we must think about. First, we have to castle the king. This we have done. We have to fight for the center. We have kind of done this as well. But also, most importantly, we must develop the pieces. And we have plenty of pieces to choose from, which must be developed, most obvious being, for example, knight c3, developing the knight so that the rook can also get developed. Next, we can try to develop the bishop as well. White is doing quite well. Eventually, we will play something like king h1 and think about long-term plans, but we cannot think about any plans without any pieces developed. So king h1 maybe prepares f3 or f4, but this is not really the moment for it. And of course, tactically, it also doesn't work. Okay, castles f3. So this was also the same kind of mistake, blundering knight f2. And this time the point is not the square on not the pawn on f2, but the square on f2. So again, knight f2 seems to not have been calculated. But if you look at this position, well, what else is black supposed to play, right? You've attacked his knight. The knight, if it moves anywhere else, it will be captured, or the bishop will be captured. So not really sure what you expected here. And with 23 minutes, if you see a move that is potentially winning, we should take a look at it and sit down and calculate it seriously, because if you're going to win a knight, you will not need all of this time, right? You will be good enough with less time, so figure it out. But here f3 doesn't work, we should just play queen e1, next f3 could be considered, or simply knight c3 finishing development. After f3, knight f2, again the bishop takes the bishop on d3. Now after we move the rook, black can move the bishop away to a6, and now our pieces are terribly clustered. We have wasted time with king h1 and f3. Our pieces are not developed. Black has the bishop pair, which is actually a winning advantage at this point, combining the bishop pair with the development with f6 moves like this, black will open up the e-file probably, and we will not be in time to develop anymore. We have been too late. But okay, bishop b5, this is worse because it allows knight c3 with tempo. Now the bishop should move, and white is doing a lot better than in the previous variation, because he has time for example, knight a4, and trying to get the square on e3, on c5. After bishop e3, we would get a similar position that happened in the game. Okay, bishop e3, and rook takes d5, a very good find by white. Well, we're losing the exchange either way, so here we are at least getting a pawn. So now we get this position, and again, black is slightly better because of his exchange up, but when we're sacrificing an exchange, the first question that we should always ask is, how good are the rooks? And here it turns out the rooks are not that great, at least for the moment. The b-file will be blocked by the move b3 very easily. Otherwise, black should aim for f6, but with the bishop on d4, this will be quite difficult. Well, white's plan is very easy, though I'm not sure you understood the plan. It's, again, to use this pawn majority on the king side, 4 against 3. So we must advance these pawns to attack this king eventually. Of course, develop the queen and the rook at some point as well. Okay, bishop moves, bishop d4, queen d2, a good move, and rook e1. So very nice. White has finished the development, and now we can look for a plan, and it's quite easy at 4 f5, continuing with f6 or e6 based on the situation. Queen h4, and now instead of pushing the pawn, while white makes the move bishop f2, but this just makes the bishop worse. Right? The bishop was greatly placed on the d4 square, defending e5 and laterally helping with the king side attack. Queen h5, bishop g3, so it seems white did not really understand his plan because he is blocking his king side majority. So now f4, and here again, when we're talking about the exchange sacrifice, we should think about the rooks. And here the rooks are not great because this is not a threat. We can just recapture. The bishop is looking at e5, so this means we have time to simply take a pawn. But instead white takes here, but this is very hard to understand because it opens up all of black's rooks, also makes our bishop worse on e1, and generally all of black's pieces are now in the game. After d4, it seems the game is over because we cannot take, and the rook e2 is coming, and the bishop is also open because there is no bishop which had stood on d4. So it's kind of hard to understand why we're opening up the opponent's rooks and also worsening our pieces instead of just taking a free pawn. Here I'm not sure what exactly black had in mind, as now we have 2 pawns for the exchange. Okay, this happens, and black doesn't use the moment, he just recaptures, which is very slow. This pawn was not really threatening anything. After d4 again, there's not too much to calculate here. The next move will be rook e2 if the knight moves, and the g2 is dropping. So here h3, again, white has terrible pieces, we should try to improve them. h3 is a bit slow, and finally black has one more chance to play d4. At this time it should be again kind of obvious, though here after bishop takes d4, the point is not some immediate tactic but the move queen g3, after which rook e1 is threatened. There's not that much white can do, not to mention there's a threat of queen h3 as well. So instead queen h6, but now white gets enough time to consolidate, and king h2 is a very nice move, not allowing some tactics with queen h3 at any point, and generally getting the queen to a better square. Rook d8, bishop takes a7, so a free pawn, as white can afford to take it, as the last move of black is not very threatening. Queen g7, bishop d4. At this point it turns out even white is better, because all of his pieces have found decent squares, all of black's pieces have become worse, and notice this, and white has now a quite easy plan of pushing the a pawn, or trying to play on this square. This knight can get maneuvered to some weaknesses on the king side, so white has the easier play as well. Rook d6, a4, easy moves, bishop c5, Not sure what the point of this move was, as white already had quite an easy plan of pushing the queenside pawns, a5, b4, b5. So a move like bishop c5 is quite unnecessary. It does win the pawn on d5 though, so maybe there's not that much to criticize. Rook e6, queen d5, and king h8, and a check was given. Maybe knight e4 is better to block the rook. Next move could be maybe f5 and trying to get to the f6 square. Okay, queen a8. At this point, white is winning because he has a lot of material, and white should be winning this position, and his most obvious plan is to push the a-pawn as far as possible. This is what he does. Bishop c6, and here queen f2. The engine suggests knight d5, which is not terribly natural, but it does allow white to push his newly created queenside majority with c4, defending the knight forever. Next b4, b5, a6, and the moves should flow naturally. As black's bishop is blocked, the rook is not very effective, and the queen is terrible as well. Okay, queen f2 is a bit more natural, but it allows the bishop to remain active. So rook e8, g4, but this is already a very strange move. The most important part in chess is the king. We must not forget the point of chess is checkmate, and if we're weakening the king unprovoked like this, checkmate to our king will be a lot easier to orchestrate for the opponent. So even though at this point the objective evaluation is still good for white, moves like this really don't help. Again, white had an easy plan to push his queenside pawn, and the pawn will not promote yet because this square is defended. But if we get the pawn to a7, then the constant threat of this pawn will be enough to distract some of black's pieces, probably the rook or the bishop, or both of them, and we will be able to start attacking other things. Maybe redevelop the knight somewhere, or the bishop can attack f6. White has a very easy play. After g4, the king is forever weakened, this diagonal as well. Queen f7, bishop d4, king g7, g5. So white wins another pawn, though we didn't really need any more pawns. We still could win with the pawns that we already had. But here, of course, another, what you called an obvious blunder. But keep in mind, it only becomes obvious after the opponent makes use of the blunder. And at this point, it is too late, right? So we should think about these things beforehand. And again, a forcing move was missed, right? Just like knight f2, this is the same thing. So this is quite unfortunate. And of course, white is winning, again, by pushing the a-pawn, remaneuvering the pieces, somehow b4, b5. And as long as this king doesn't get checkmated, he should be fine. But after this, the game is over. And later, black managed to get kind of flagged and lose his rook. But of course, black should be winning from here on, as he is a rook ahead. White does have some kind of compensation in the form of 4 pawns, but it shouldn't really be enough, especially with this weakened king. So hopefully this was useful, and try not to kind of forget about these blunders, right? These are quite systematic issues, and I think you should consider looking at your opponent's forcing moves a bit more seriously, because these are the blunders that decide games. So I see you next time, and good luck.